You probably already know that the actual Underground Railroad had nothing to do with real trains steaming underground into man-made tunnels. The term was born in the days of slavery. There's a legend that a Kentucky slave owner was the first to use it when he described how quickly one of his slaves escaped from his farm. It was as if he stepped onto a train and disappeared into an underground tunnel. For the most part, the Underground Railroad was a loosely structured, spontaneous liberation movement that evolved over time. Its peak years were from 1850 until the end of the Civil War. As more slaves escaped from their owners, more people, black and white, risked their lives to help them escape. Across America, wherever there were people who opposed slavery and were willing to help fugitives escape, the Underground Railroad was there. It was particularly active in border regions like southern Indiana, and cities like New Albany played a critical role in the Underground Railroad's success. We'll never know everyone who was involved. Most of their names and often their deeds have been lost. The story of the Underground Railroad starts with slavery. White Europeans came to America seeking opportunity and freedom to govern their own lives. But African people first set foot on this soil as prisoners. Kidnapped from their homes in Africa, stripped of all their possessions, and ripped from families, friends, and communities, they were shackled and chained together, crammed into airless compartments below a ship's deck, and forced to endure a 3,000-mile voyage. Those Africans who made it here alive were the only people who came to America with no hope of making a better life for themselves. They were slaves who were bought, sold, and worked hard, sometimes to the point of death. Even though many colonists and early Americans opposed it, in the early years of our nation, slave owning became legal. Throughout the American South, plantation owners used the forced labor of slaves to transform thousands of acres of southern farmland into plantations for cotton, tobacco, and rice, while northern entrepreneurs built financial empires from the southern trade. By the early 19th century, most northern states adopted laws prohibiting the owning of slaves, while southern states began more aggressively defending it, and the gap between them widened. By law, slaves had no rights. They were property. They could be bought and sold on a whim. For some slaves, this life was unbearable, and despite the risks, they elected to escape or steal away from their owners. The map makes it look like such a simple matter to leave a slave state and enter a free one, but it wasn't as easy as it looks. Escaping was extremely difficult. Slaves worked at least 6 days a week, often 7, from before sunrise to long after sunset, no matter the weather. Summoning the physical strength to escape was impossible for many. And whether they worked in the fields or in the owner's house, somebody was watching to make sure they couldn't run off. By the 1840s and 1850s, Louisville, Kentucky was a magnet for fugitive slaves. Some came from states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, but many more were escaping from owners who lived in Kentucky, even Louisville. Farming in Kentucky didn't require the number of slaves it did in the cotton states. So over time, Kentucky slave owners had developed a lucrative business selling off their unneeded slaves to plantation owners in the Deep South. Slave auctions were held in Louisville near the wharf, at 2nd and Main Streets, and at 1st and Market. Many of those who were sold were shackled with leg irons to prevent their running and taken straight from the auction block to board a steamer headed south. But some blacks living in Louisville weren't slaves at all. They were free. Many of them former slaves who had been freed by their owners or directly purchased their own freedom, thanks to the help of friends and family. Although escaping slaves often found help among Louisville's free black community, the city was still a dangerous place for escaping slaves. Bounty hunters, slave catchers, and members of the city police force regularly patrolled the riverbanks and scoured city streets and alleyways in search of runaway slaves. The greatest danger, however, came from informers, many of whom were ferry captains, always on the lookout for runaways they could turn in for a little extra cash. Technically, Indiana was a free state, but that didn't mean runaway slaves were free once they made it to the Indiana shore. A slave owner or slave hunter could track fugitives into Indiana, and they had the legal right to capture them and take them back across the river. The slave catchers sometimes even kidnapped free blacks, then carried them across to Louisville and sold them at auction. The only place where slaves could be truly free and safe from capture was across the border in Canada, a safe haven for America's escaped slaves. 1 mile, that's the distance between Louisville and the Indiana shore, between a slave-holding state and a free one. New Albany in the 1850s and 1860s was certainly no haven for escaping slaves, but it was an important gateway to freedom. For slaves, the Ohio River was their Jordan River, the river to freedom.
Indiana might be north, but I'd be hard-pressed to call it a good place for Negroes to live. No matter how hard a black man works, he still can't vote. And thanks to our state legislature, a free black can't even move into the state anymore.
In the middle decades of the 19th century, many of our nation's churches found themselves embroiled in bitter arguments over slavery. Preachers on both sides of the issue delivered passionate sermons and quoted scripture to justify their positions. In New Albany, this debate was particularly heated in the Presbyterian and Methodist churches, whose ministers frequently used their pulpits to speak against slavery.
In my church, Second Presbyterian, the Reverend Atterbury does more than just preach. When a runaway is discovered, the Reverend calls on one of the ladies of the church to fix a hearty meal for the traveler. When they've filled their stomachs and rested their bones, someone sees to it that they have a few dollars and the name of someone up the road who can be trusted.
I can't say all white people are bad. I've known many you can count on when you need help, even if that meant breaking the law. Listen to this letter a friend of mine showed me a few days ago. It's written by a white man living not too far from here. You'll see he does the right thing. Let me get there. Here it is. Mr. Butler came to see Father, knowing him to be an abolitionist. He said there were 2 fugitives secreted in his barn, and he did not know what to do with them. But here's the important part. He could not bear to see them captured and carried back to slavery. Now, Mr. Butler, he wasn't a politician or a preacher or a philosopher. He was just an ordinary man who woke up one morning heading for the barn to do his chores and discovered that he held the lives of 2 people in his hands. And instead of handing them over to the sheriff, he listened to his heart and made sure they got a safe transportation north.
In New Albany and throughout southern Indiana, members of the free black community were the backbone of the Underground Railroad. Many were descended from families who had lived in the region from the earliest days of settlement. Of course, not everyone in the black community was part of the Underground Railroad. Some were understandably reluctant to risk their own freedom and economic security because the penalties for a black person caught helping runaway slaves were much harsher than they were for a white person. But the Underground Railroad could not have succeeded without numbers of African Americans in Indiana and elsewhere who were willing to risk everything to help total strangers. Since many free blacks were unskilled, they took jobs in transportation, which usually required physical strength rather than training. An added benefit of these jobs was that access to transportation became key to the Underground Railroad's success. Before the Civil War, few white churches encouraged blacks to attend. For that reason, there was a drive within the black community in New Albany to establish their own churches where free blacks could freely worship. In addition to serving the spiritual needs of their members, black churches provided an anchor in the community, the first public place where blacks could gather without fear on Sunday or any other day. Although it's exciting to imagine tunnels and secret rooms, hidden wells and passageways, the Underground Railroad was never as much about places as it was about people. Workers for the Underground Railroad in our community were black and white, rich and poor, barbers and school teachers, as well as dock workers, doctors, rivermen, wagon masters, judges, farmers, hotel owners, homemakers, civic leaders, shopkeepers, and preachers. In short, those who assisted fugitive slaves came from every walk of life. Anyone who helped even one fugitive slave escape was breaking federal law. If they got caught, they faced huge fines and prison terms and ran the risk of being beaten by the slave catchers.
They called folks that take runaways on the Underground Railroad conductors. Around here, though, we just call them friends. If you want to be a good friend, then you got to be smart, and you got to think fast and work quick. You've also got to know this country like the back of your hand. Every back road, blind corner, and wagon rut, because you'll need to use them if you're going to keep out of jail. On top of it all, you got to be lucky.
In April 1861, friction between North and South finally erupted into civil war. On April 9, 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered, and the process of reuniting North and South as these United States began. 8 months after that, the states ratified the 13th Amendment. The institution of human slavery, as it had been practiced in America for over 200 years, was now illegal. In the struggle against slavery, the Underground Railroad was a powerful weapon, and its workers in New Albany and Floyd County and across the nation distinguished themselves. The courage and conviction of these men and women and their determination to resist the injustice of slavery gave hope to blacks and opened the hearts and minds of many whites. Their acts showed bravery in the face of great danger, sacrifice with no expectation of personal gain, determination against all odds. Without an army, with no powerful president or great commanding general, the Underground Railroad proved that ordinary people can accomplish great good when they are guided by their own humanity. Whether or not the men and women of the Underground Railroad were related to us by blood, they have handed down a great legacy. No matter the color of our skin, or the religion we practice, our age, gender, or ability, it is up to each one of us to honor the cause of freedom for all people and continue the fight for justice and equality. When we do, the spirit of the Underground Railroad lives on.